Hello there, fellow travelers through time. Tonight, we're going to journey back 2,000 years to experience one of the most grueling and unforgiving military careers in human history. So please, settle yourself comfortably wherever you are listening from tonight. Perhaps dim the lights and wrap yourself in a warm blanket, and let me know in the comments where you're joining us from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you listening from a cozy bedroom in Manchester as autumn rain patters against your window? Perhaps from a quiet apartment in Berlin as the city settles into evening? Maybe you're in a small town in Ohio, watching the first snow of winter fall silently outside? Wherever you are, you're about to discover why the seemingly glorious life of a Roman legionary was actually a nightmare of suffering, brutality, and early death that would break the strongest modern person within hours. If this journey into the harsh realities of ancient military life helps you appreciate the comfort of your warm bed and peaceful evening, perhaps consider subscribing to join us on more explorations through history's most challenging experiences. And don't forget to like this video if it helps you drift peacefully into sleep. Think your job is tough? Think your commute is brutal? Think your boss is demanding? Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your day will involve marching 25 miles in full armor weighing 60 pounds, digging fortifications with your bare hands until they bleed, eating moldy bread crawling with maggots, and facing the very real possibility that you'll die horribly in battle, from disease, or from the casual cruelty of your own officers. Imagine signing up for what you thought would be 25 years of steady pay and Roman citizenship, only to discover that you've essentially sold yourself into a form of legalized slavery where your life belongs entirely to men who view you as completely expendable. This is the reality that faced every single Roman legionary who ever lived, the harsh truth behind the glory and conquest that built one of history's greatest empires on the broken bodies and crushed spirits of millions of ordinary men. Picture, if you will, the Mediterranean world of the 1st century CE, when Rome's power stretched from the foggy highlands of northern Britain to the scorching deserts of North Africa, from the Atlantic shores of Spain to the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia. This vast empire, covering nearly 2 million square miles and governing perhaps 60 million people, seemed to represent the pinnacle of human civilization. Roman roads connected distant provinces with engineering precision that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. Roman aqueducts brought fresh water to cities across 3 continents. Roman law provided a framework for justice that influenced legal systems for millennia to come. Roman culture produced literature, architecture, and art that still inspires wonder today. But this magnificent empire was built and maintained through the systematic application of organized violence on a scale that beggars the imagination. At the heart of Rome's military machine were the legions, professional armies of citizen soldiers who served for decades far from home, conquering new territories and suppressing rebellions with ruthless efficiency. These weren't the noble warriors of Hollywood films or the disciplined heroes of patriotic propaganda. They were mostly poor men from rural areas who joined the army because they had no other options for survival. Men who discovered too late that military service meant signing away their humanity for a quarter-century of brutality and degradation. The Roman military recruitment system was designed to prey on desperation and economic necessity. In theory, legionary service was limited to Roman citizens, which gave it a veneer of privilege and honor. In practice, the army recruited from the poorest segments of society, men who had lost their farms to debt, young men from families that couldn't afford to support them, and desperate individuals who saw military service as their only escape from starvation. The recruitment officers who traveled through rural areas weren't looking for volunteers. They were running what amounted to a sophisticated con game, painting pictures of steady pay, regular meals, and eventual citizenship benefits while carefully omitting the horrific realities of what military service actually involved. The moment a recruit took the military oath, the sacramentum, his legal status changed fundamentally. He was no longer a free citizen with rights and protections under Roman law. He became military property, subject to absolute discipline and liable to punishment that could include flogging, mutilation, or execution for even minor infractions. The oath ceremony itself was designed to impress upon new soldiers that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. They swore by all the gods to obey their officers without question, to fight wherever they were commanded, and to accept whatever hardships the army imposed upon them. Breaking this oath was considered not just desertion but sacrilege, punishable by death and eternal damnation. The training that transformed civilians into legionaries was a carefully designed program of physical and psychological brutality that would violate every modern standard of humane treatment. New recruits were immediately stripped of their individual identities and subjected to constant humiliation designed to break their will and rebuild them as instruments of military violence. They were given new names, new clothes, and new identities as property of the Roman state. Their heads were shaved, their civilian clothes burned, and their personal possessions confiscated. From the moment they entered training camp, they learned that their individual wants, needs, and opinions were irrelevant. Only absolute obedience mattered. The physical training was designed to push human endurance far beyond normal limits. Recruits were required to march for hours in full gear over increasingly difficult terrain, carrying not just their weapons and armor, but also construction tools, cooking equipment, and personal supplies. The standard legionary pack, including armor, weapons, food, and engineering tools, weighed between 60 and 80 pounds, roughly equivalent to carrying a large adult person on your back while hiking through mountains. The training marches began at distances that seemed manageable, perhaps 5 or 10 miles, but quickly escalated to the standard military pace of 25 miles per day, often over terrain deliberately chosen for its difficulty. But the physical hardship was just the beginning. Roman military training included systematic instruction in every aspect of organized violence, from individual combat techniques to large-scale battlefield tactics. Recruits spent hours each day practicing sword work, spear fighting, and formation fighting using wooden weapons against training posts, and eventually against each other. The training was deliberately brutal, designed to inflict real pain and injury so that soldiers would become accustomed to violence and immune to squeamishness about hurting other human beings. The psychological conditioning was even more devastating than the physical abuse. Trainers used techniques that modern military psychologists would recognize as systematic dehumanization, designed to break down recruits' natural reluctance to kill and their attachment to civilian moral values. Soldiers were taught to view enemies not as fellow human beings but as obstacles to be eliminated. They practiced combat techniques on prisoners of war and slaves, learning to inflict maximum damage with clinical detachment. They were encouraged to develop emotional bonds only with their fellow soldiers, while treating everyone outside the military as potential enemies. The disciplinary system that governed legionary life was based on terror and arbitrary punishment designed to ensure absolute obedience through fear. Roman military law recognized dozens of offenses punishable by death, including not just obvious crimes like desertion or mutiny, but also relatively minor infractions like falling asleep on guard duty, losing equipment, or showing insufficient enthusiasm during training. The punishments were deliberately brutal and public, designed to terrorize other soldiers into compliance. Flogging was the most common punishment for minor offenses, but Roman military flogging bore no resemblance to the relatively mild corporal punishment used in civilian contexts. Military flogging used specialized whips designed to inflict maximum pain and permanent injury. The victim was stripped naked and tied to a post while officers used whips embedded with metal fragments, bone chips, or sharpened stones to tear the flesh from their back and legs. Soldiers were required to watch these punishment sessions, learning firsthand what would happen to them if they disobeyed orders or showed any sign of independence. For more serious offenses, the army employed punishments that were essentially torture designed to serve as examples to other soldiers. Soldiers who were caught deserting might have their hands cut off, their eyes gouged out, or their tongues removed before being crucified in front of their former comrades. Those convicted of cowardice in battle could be forced to run a gauntlet where their fellow soldiers beat them with clubs and stones, often resulting in death or permanent disability. The army also used a punishment called decimation for units that performed poorly in battle, randomly selecting every 10th soldier to be beaten to death by his 9 comrades, creating a climate of terror that made soldiers more afraid of their own officers than of enemy forces. The living conditions that legionaries endured during their decades of service were designed to minimize costs to the Roman state while maintaining the soldiers' capacity for violence, with no consideration whatsoever for comfort, health, or basic human dignity. Legionary camps were essentially mobile prisons where soldiers lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions that would be considered inhumane for animals by modern standards. 8 soldiers shared a single tent that provided barely enough space for them to lie down, with no privacy, no personal space, and no escape from the constant presence of their comrades. The daily routine was carefully structured to fill every waking moment with military activities, leaving no time for personal reflection, correspondence with home, or any activity that might remind soldiers of their civilian identities. The day began before dawn with trumpet calls that roused soldiers for immediate duty. There was no gradual awakening, no time to orient themselves or prepare mentally for the day ahead. They were expected to be ready for action within minutes of the wake-up call, dressed, armed, and ready to march, fight, or work as their officers commanded. The food provided to legionaries was designed to meet minimum nutritional requirements while costing as little as possible, with no consideration for taste, variety, or eating pleasure. The basic legionary diet consisted primarily of wheat or barley that soldiers ground into flour and baked into hard, virtually inedible bread that could survive for weeks without spoiling. This bread was often moldy, weevil-infested, or contaminated with mouse droppings, but soldiers were expected to eat it without complaint. Protein came mainly from bacon or salt pork that was frequently rancid by the time it was consumed, supplemented occasionally by cheese that was usually spoiled or hard enough to break teeth. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare luxuries that most legionaries saw only when they could forage in conquered territories or when local populations were forced to provide tribute. The water supply was often contaminated with human and animal waste, leading to constant outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases that killed more soldiers than enemy action. Soldiers learned to drink watered wine not because it was a pleasant luxury, but because the alcohol helped kill some of the bacteria that made straight water deadly. The medical care available to injured or sick legionaries was primitive in the extreme, based on superstition and folk remedies rather than any understanding of anatomy, hygiene, or disease transmission. Roman military medicine was primarily concerned with getting wounded soldiers back into action as quickly as possible, regardless of their long-term health or quality of life. Battlefield surgery was performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or proper surgical instruments, often causing more damage than the original wounds. Soldiers who were wounded in battle faced agonizing procedures performed by medical personnel whose training consisted mainly of watching other surgeries and learning through trial and error on living patients. Amputations were performed with ordinary knives or saws, cauterization was done with red-hot iron rods, and patients were expected to remain conscious and cooperative throughout procedures that would challenge modern patients, even with full anesthesia and pain management. Many soldiers died not from their original wounds but from infections, blood loss, or shock caused by the medical treatment itself. Those who survived serious injuries often found themselves permanently disabled but still required to fulfill their military obligations. Soldiers who had lost limbs, suffered severe burns, or sustained other permanently disabling injuries were often assigned to non-combat duties but received no additional medical care, disability compensation, or assistance with the basic activities of daily living. They were expected to continue serving until their enlistment period ended, regardless of their physical condition or ability to perform meaningful military functions. The system of military discipline extended far beyond formal punishments to encompass every aspect of daily life, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance and mutual intimidation that prevented soldiers from developing any sense of personal autonomy or individual identity. Soldiers were encouraged to inform on their comrades for any sign of disloyalty, dissatisfaction, or failure to meet military standards. This created a climate of paranoia and mistrust that made genuine friendships difficult and turned every conversation into a potential source of danger. The officers who commanded legionary units were typically members of the Roman upper classes who viewed common soldiers as barely human tools to be used and discarded as military necessity required. These officers had received military training, but their education focused on strategy, tactics, and command rather than any understanding of or concern for the welfare of individual soldiers. They lived in separate quarters, ate different food, and enjoyed privileges and comforts that were completely unavailable to common legionaries. The social gulf between officers and enlisted men was deliberately maintained through differences in dress, housing, food, and treatment that constantly reminded soldiers of their inferior status. Officers wore elaborate armor and clothing that marked their rank and status, while common soldiers were issued standardized equipment that emphasized their interchangeable nature. Officers dined on imported delicacies and fine wine while soldiers ate moldy bread and rancid meat. Officers slept in private quarters with comfortable furnishings while soldiers crowded into shared tents with minimal bedding. The career prospects available to common legionaries were deliberately limited to prevent them from developing ambitions beyond military service. Promotion to the lowest officer ranks was theoretically possible but extremely rare in practice, reserved for soldiers who had demonstrated exceptional loyalty and competence over many years of service. Most soldiers could expect to spend their entire 25-year enlistment period in the same basic rank they had achieved within their first few years of service. The pay that soldiers received was carefully calculated to provide just enough money to meet basic survival needs while preventing them from accumulating enough wealth to purchase their way out of military service or establish independent lives outside the army. Legionary pay was also subject to numerous deductions for equipment, food, clothing, and other necessities, often leaving soldiers with barely enough money to purchase small personal items or send occasional letters home to their families. The equipment that legionaries were required to maintain and carry represented a significant financial burden that further reduced their already meager effective income. Soldiers were personally responsible for the cost of replacing lost, damaged, or worn-out equipment, including armor, weapons, tools, and personal gear. The cost of this equipment often exceeded a soldier's annual pay, forcing them to go into debt to the army and creating another mechanism to ensure they could never leave military service. The famous Roman roads that connected the empire were built primarily by legionary labor under conditions that would be considered criminal by modern standards. Soldiers were required to construct and maintain these roads while carrying full military equipment and maintaining combat readiness, often working in hostile territory where they faced constant threat of attack by local populations who resented Roman occupation. Road construction involved backbreaking labor that required soldiers to move massive quantities of stone, gravel, and earth using only hand tools and primitive lifting devices. They dug foundations through solid rock, quarried stone blocks weighing hundreds of pounds, and transported materials over long distances without mechanical assistance. The work was performed regardless of weather conditions, with soldiers expected to continue construction during storms, extreme heat, or freezing cold that made manual labor dangerous and exhausting. The engineering projects that legionaries were required to complete went far beyond road construction to include bridges, aqueducts, fortifications, and entire cities built under military supervision. These projects required soldiers to master complex construction techniques while maintaining their combat training and military duties. They learned masonry, carpentry, surveying, and hydraulic engineering through hands-on experience that often resulted in serious injuries or death when projects failed or accidents occurred. The military camps that legionaries constructed each night during campaign marches were elaborate temporary fortifications that required hours of intensive labor after already exhausting days of marching and fighting. Roman military doctrine required soldiers to dig defensive ditches, construct earthen ramparts, and erect palisades around every camp, regardless of how briefly they planned to occupy the site. This meant that soldiers who had marched 25 miles in full gear might spend additional hours digging fortifications before they could rest, eat, or attend to personal needs. The camp construction process was rigidly standardized and required soldiers to work with precision and speed even when they were exhausted, injured, or sick. They dug ditches 6 feet deep and 8 feet wide around the entire perimeter of the camp, throwing the excavated earth inward to create ramparts topped with sharpened wooden stakes. They constructed gates, watchtowers, and internal roads according to strict specifications that had to be followed exactly regardless of local terrain or conditions. The speed with which these fortifications had to be completed left no room for rest or recovery, even for soldiers who were suffering from injuries, illness, or exhaustion. Officers expected the work to be completed within a few hours of arriving at a campsite, and soldiers who failed to meet these deadlines faced severe punishment. The physical demands of daily camp construction, combined with the constant marching and fighting, pushed human endurance far beyond sustainable limits. The weapons training that legionaries underwent was designed to transform them into efficient killing machines capable of executing complex battlefield maneuvers while engaging in close combat with enemy forces. Roman military tactics relied heavily on disciplined formation fighting that required soldiers to suppress their individual survival instincts and fight as coordinated units even when facing overwhelming odds or certain death. The gladius, the short sword that was the legionaries' primary weapon, was designed specifically for close-quarters combat that required soldiers to get within arm's length of their enemies. Fighting with a gladius meant engaging in intensely personal combat where soldiers could see their opponents' faces, hear their dying words, and feel their blood spilling over their hands. The psychological impact of this kind of intimate violence was devastating for most soldiers, requiring extensive conditioning to overcome natural human reluctance to kill. Javelin training taught soldiers to use their pilum, heavy throwing spears designed to penetrate enemy shields and armor at distances up to 30 yards. The javelin was engineered to bend upon impact, preventing enemies from throwing it back and making enemy shields useless by adding weight that couldn't be removed. Soldiers learned to throw these weapons with deadly accuracy while marching in formation, often having just seconds to target and engage enemies before switching to close combat with their swords. Shield work was equally important, as the scutum, the large rectangular shield carried by legionaries, was used not just for defense but as an offensive weapon capable of knocking enemies off balance or crushing them against obstacles. The shield weighed nearly 20 pounds and was covered with metal bosses that could inflict serious damage when used to strike opponents. Soldiers learned to coordinate shield movements with their comrades to create defensive walls that could withstand arrow volleys, cavalry charges, or infantry attacks. The battle formations that legionaries were trained to execute required them to maintain precise positioning and timing even while facing terrifying enemy forces intent on killing them. The famous testudo or turtle formation required soldiers to overlap their shields to create a mobile fortress that could advance under heavy missile fire, but executing this formation successfully required perfect coordination among dozens of soldiers who might be wounded, terrified, or disoriented by combat. The manipular tactics that made Roman armies so effective required individual soldiers to fight with discipline and precision while their comrades were being killed around them. Soldiers learned to advance and retreat in coordinated movements, to rotate fresh fighters to the front lines while allowing exhausted warriors to recover, and to maintain formation integrity even when parts of their unit were being destroyed by enemy action. The siege warfare techniques that legionaries mastered involved some of the most dangerous and psychologically demanding military operations possible. Soldiers were required to construct and operate siege engines under constant enemy fire, to tunnel under enemy fortifications while risking burial alive, and to assault heavily defended positions where casualties often exceeded 50% of the attacking force. Siege work required specialized skills in carpentry, engineering, and mining that soldiers had to learn while serving in active combat zones. They built catapults, ballistas, siege towers, and battering rams using materials scavenged from the local area, often working within range of enemy archers and artillery. The construction of these devices required precise measurements and careful assembly, but it had to be completed quickly under battlefield conditions where mistakes could result in death or injury to the construction crews. The actual assault on enemy fortifications was the most terrifying experience that legionaries faced, requiring them to advance against prepared defensive positions while carrying scaling ladders, grappling hooks, and other assault equipment. Siege assaults typically resulted in enormous casualties among the attacking forces, but soldiers were expected to continue advancing regardless of losses and to maintain their formations even when their comrades were being killed by arrows, stones, or boiling oil. The psychological preparation for siege warfare included systematic desensitization to violence and death that gradually eroded soldiers' natural human empathy and moral restraints. Soldiers were encouraged to view enemy civilians as legitimate targets and to participate in the massacre and enslavement that typically followed successful siege operations. They learned to see extreme violence not as a regrettable necessity but as an enjoyable expression of Roman superiority. The campaign seasons that defined legionary life involved months of continuous military operations in hostile territory far from any source of supply, medical care, or reinforcement. Soldiers were expected to maintain combat effectiveness while living off the land in areas where local populations were actively trying to kill them. They marched through deserts, mountains, forests, and swamps while carrying everything they needed for survival and combat. The logistics of campaign operations required soldiers to forage for food, water, and supplies while maintaining military discipline and readiness for combat. They learned to identify edible plants, locate water sources, and improvise shelter using materials available in the field. But foraging often meant taking what they needed from local populations, turning soldiers into raiders and bandits who survived by terrorizing civilian communities. The disease environment of military campaigns was extraordinarily dangerous, with soldiers constantly exposed to pathogens, parasites, and environmental hazards that could kill them as easily as enemy weapons. Dysentery, typhoid, malaria, and other diseases spread rapidly through military units that lived in close quarters without proper sanitation. Soldiers often continued marching and fighting while suffering from serious illnesses that would require hospitalization by modern medical standards. The isolation from family and home that campaign operations involved was psychologically devastating for soldiers who might spend years in foreign territories without any communication from their loved ones. Letters were rare and unreliable, taking months or years to reach their destinations, if they arrived at all. Soldiers often learned about family deaths, births, marriages, or other significant events years after they had occurred. The winter quarters that provided soldiers with their only respite from active campaigning were often only marginally better than field conditions. Winter camps were constructed by soldier labor and designed primarily to keep men alive until the next campaign season rather than to provide comfort or decent living conditions. Soldiers spent the winter months maintaining equipment, training recruits, and preparing for the next year's operations. Even during winter quarters, military discipline remained harsh and unforgiving. Soldiers were not granted leave to visit families or pursue personal interests. They remained under constant military control, subject to the same punishments and restrictions that governed their lives during active campaigns. The winter months provided an opportunity for intensive training and conditioning that prepared them for even more demanding operations in the coming year. The veteran soldiers who survived multiple campaign seasons were profoundly changed by their experiences in ways that made it difficult or impossible for them to reintegrate into civilian society. They had been conditioned to respond to problems with violence, to view civilians as potential threats or victims, and to survive in environments where normal human social relationships were impossible. The discharge process that ended a legionary's military service was designed to provide minimal benefits while ensuring that veterans posed no threat to Roman society. Soldiers who completed their 25-year enlistment received land grants in military colonies far from their original homes, effectively exiling them to frontier areas where they could continue to serve Roman interests as settlers and local defenders. The land grants that veterans received were often in recently conquered territories where they faced continued danger from hostile local populations. The grants were frequently insufficient to support a family and required extensive development before they could produce agricultural income. Many veterans found themselves unable to make a living from their land grants and were forced to supplement their income through activities that civilian populations found disturbing or threatening. The medical problems that veterans faced as a result of their military service received no systematic attention or care from Roman society. Soldiers who had suffered injuries, contracted diseases, or experienced psychological trauma during their service were expected to cope with these problems on their own. There were no veterans' hospitals, no disability benefits, and no recognition that military service might have created ongoing health problems that required specialized care. The social isolation that many veterans experienced reflected civilian society's discomfort with men who had been trained for violence and had spent decades in military environments. Veterans often found it difficult to relate to civilian concerns and priorities, while civilians were often afraid of men who had been conditioned to solve problems through force and intimidation. The families that legionaries left behind when they enlisted faced decades of uncertainty about whether their sons, fathers, or brothers were still alive. Military service effectively removed men from their families and communities for the prime years of their adult lives, creating economic and social hardships for dependents who had to survive without male support or protection. The recruitment system that fed new soldiers into the legions was designed to target the most vulnerable members of Roman society, men who had few alternatives to military service and little understanding of what they were agreeing to when they took the military oath. The recruiters who traveled through rural areas painted romantic pictures of military life while carefully concealing the brutal realities that recruits would face. The economic pressures that drove men to enlist were carefully maintained by Roman policies that favored large landowners over small farmers, creating a steady supply of displaced agricultural workers who had no choice but to join the army. The Roman economy depended on having a large population of men who were desperate enough to accept military service despite its known hardships and dangers. The training casualties that resulted from the brutal conditioning process that transformed civilians into soldiers were simply accepted as necessary costs of creating an effective military force. Soldiers who were killed or permanently disabled during training were quickly replaced with new recruits, and no effort was made to modify training procedures to reduce casualties or injuries. The cultural glorification of military service that characterized Roman society served to obscure the brutal realities of legionary life behind patriotic rhetoric about duty, honor, and service to the state. The poets, historians, and propagandists who celebrated Roman military victories rarely mentioned the human costs of maintaining the armies that made those victories possible. The psychological conditioning that turned ordinary men into efficient killers had profound effects that extended far beyond military service into every aspect of Roman society. Veterans brought their capacity for violence and their casual attitude toward human suffering into civilian communities, contributing to the general acceptance of slavery, gladiatorial games, and other forms of institutionalized brutality that characterized Roman culture. The technological innovations that made Roman armies so effective were designed primarily to maximize killing efficiency rather than to protect soldiers or reduce casualties. Roman weapons, armor, and tactics were optimized for offensive operations that could inflict maximum damage on enemy forces while accepting enormous losses among Roman soldiers as an acceptable cost of victory. The strategic thinking that guided Roman military operations viewed individual soldiers as completely expendable resources to be used and discarded as military necessity required. Roman commanders routinely planned operations that would result in massive casualties among their own forces, calculating that the strategic benefits of victory justified any human cost. The historical legacy of the Roman military system has been systematically sanitized by later scholars and popular culture that focus on Roman achievements while ignoring the human suffering that made those achievements possible. The reality of legionary life was carefully concealed behind legends of heroism and honor that bear no resemblance to the brutal experiences of actual soldiers. As you settle into your comfortable bed tonight, surrounded by the warmth and safety of your modern life, reflect on the extraordinary suffering that ordinary men endured to build one of history's greatest empires. Consider how their sacrifice of comfort, health, family relationships, and ultimately their humanity made possible the roads, laws, and cultural achievements that we still admire today. The price of Roman greatness was paid not by emperors or senators, but by millions of anonymous soldiers whose names have been forgotten, but whose suffering echoes through the centuries as a reminder of what human beings will endure when they have no other choice. Let their stories remind you that behind every great historical achievement lie countless individual tragedies, and that the progress of civilization has often required ordinary people to sacrifice their hopes, dreams, and lives for causes they barely understood. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that you will never face the brutal choices that confronted every Roman legionary, and that your problems, however challenging they may seem, pale in comparison to the daily nightmare that was military service in the ancient world. The ghosts of the legions march eternal, carrying with them the lesson that human resilience has limits, but that when survival is at stake, people will endure almost anything rather than surrender to despair.